Welcome to our third fall 2023 HMEI Faculty Seminar. Very excited today that we have Professor Rachael DeLue from the Department of Art and Archaeology, also a professor there, but also its chair. In preparing for this, I had the very, it's not a surprise, but the very pleasant realization that this person that I know primarily as a wonderful person, human being, parent of, is also quite an accomplished scholar. Really something exciting when you see that about your friends, how amazing they really are. So Rachael is the Christopher Binion Safarim, class of 1986, professor in American art and the chair of Art and Archaeology department. She's also jointly appointed at the Efron Center for the Study of America, and is associated at the High Meadows Environmental Institute, the Native and American Indigenous Studies Initiative, and the Program in Media and Modernity. So really broad footprint here on campus. Rachael specializes in the history of American and transatlantic, I guess, art, and visual culture, with a focus on the intersections between art and science and history. Has a number of books, 1, 2, 3, 4, as I count them right, and one more coming out. That's a number.
Yeah, that sounds good. I'll take it.
That's always impressive to me. I'm involved in editing a book right now, and it's so much work. I couldn't imagine writing one from scratch. And one of them that I remember so it's the George Innes and the Science of Landscape. Right now she's currently working on a project on the Tree of Life by Charles Darwin and how we represent the world. And then today we're going to hear about the Visuality Against the Anthropocene. Anthropocene once again. So Rachael, please take us for a ride.
Gabe, thank you very much. Before I go on, can everyone hear me, including in the back? Yes, okay, great. So Gabe, thank you very much. I hope I live up to that introduction. I'll try to be as amazing as possible. I also want to take a moment to thank others who are here. I want to thank Hans and Steve for handling so beautifully and smoothly the logistics, and also Kathy, who I see over there, for being an essential part of this wonderful thing we call HMEI. So let's see. There we go. Okay. So what I'm presenting today comes out of my work on landscape representation in Europe and the Americas. And I'm showing you here 4 images of things I've written and published about, both in terms of the artists who made them and the actual images. And so Gabe mentioned a book about George Innes. On the lower left is a painting by George Innes. That comes from George Innes and the Science of Landscape. On the right is a painting by the 20th century abstract artist Arthur Dove. On the upper left is a picture of a shoreline by William Stanley Hazeltine from the 1860s. The Dove dates to the 1830s, the Innes to the 1890s. And in the middle is a sketch, which is much smaller than you see it here projected on the screen, by the 19th century American artist Thomas Cole, and it's entitled Rock, Trees, and Dog. He made it in 1846, and I'm pretty sure that I wrote about this because of the dog. I'm not shy about admitting that. So this gives you a sense of the sorts of images that are usually in my head, that is to say landscape images. And landscape is a category or genre of art, like portraiture or still life, that in the US and Europe, which are my primary areas of inquiry, emerged in the 1600s and 1700s, so the 17th and the 18th century, and reached the height of its esteem and popularity. That is to say, landscape reached the height of its esteem and popularity in the 19th century, in the 1800s. And I say this because the rise of landscape coincided with the rise of the Anthropocene. And I know that the exact dating of the Anthropocene is controversial. Many origin dates have been proposed. So I'm referring here simply to the rough timeline of the human actions that have caused irreversible planetary change. So imperialism and colonization, agriculture, deforestation, industrialization, resource extraction, so on and so forth. These are the things that also, of course, make up the geopolitical and economic origins of modernity and the modern era itself. So because the rise of landscape coincided with the rise of the Anthropocene, one can think of landscape as an Anthropocenic genre, perhaps as the Anthropocenic genre of art. And I say that because landscape was not only a product of the Anthropocene, but a witness to and a register of the human activity that has been the dominant influence on climate and environment over the past 300 years or so. Now, for this reason, as a scholar of landscape and a scholar of many other things, including the intersection between the history of art and the history of science, as Gabe said, I'm interested in what we might learn from landscape, understood as a witness to and register of the Anthropocene. And this interest is related to a broader set of questions that, as an art historian, I ask about the role that art and other forms of visual expression can play in addressing climate change in the present day. Now, art is a powerful medium. And I say that because it can show us things in a way that reality cannot. And art can also teach us to see things with new eyes. So as an art historian, I'm as much a scholar of epistemology, by which I mean the history of seeing and knowing and the grounds, the historical grounds for those things. I'm as much a scholar of the history, I'm as much a scholar of epistemology as I am the history of art, or a scholar of the styles and schools of art. Hence the term visuality in my title. Visuality refers not to the literal or physical act of seeing, but to how humans in a given historical moment see their world through forms of seeing that are shaped by their particular cultural, social, economic, scientific, philosophical, so on and so forth, historical conditions. So historically generated and constructed ways of seeing that in turn shape the creation of works of art. So in what I'm presenting today, I'm going to explore a question that I draw from this cohort of ideas and investments that I've just described. And that question is as follows. Can representations of landscape teach us to see and know existence in a manner that helps engender the forms of seeing and knowing that are needed, that are imperative in an age of climate catastrophe? Put another way, is landscape vision, the title or the phrase that I use in the title of my talk, which I'll explain more as I go, is landscape vision a thing? And if so, can it make a difference? So I want to say first a few words about the origins of landscape, or at least the origins of the term and the idea of landscape. The word landscape in English first appeared in print in 1605. There were earlier versions of the word in other languages, Landschap in Dutch and Landschaft in German. But the English term appeared in print for the first time in 1605 in a book edited by a man named Joshua Sylvester, and I won't get into the details of it, but it's a scriptural epic, which means it's a set of poems based on the scriptures, especially the book of Genesis. And the text which I'm about to read comes from a passage in the book, in one of the poems that compares the work of creation to the act of painting a landscape. And this section of the poem reads, "The cunning painter that with curious care, limning a landscape various rich and rare, has set to work in all and every part, invention, judgment, nature, use, and art. And hath at length to mortalize his name, with weary pencil perfected the same, forgets his pains, and inly filled with glee, still on his picture gazeth greedily. So that's the landscape painter being proud of his work, and that landscape painter in the poem is meant to be an analog of God, who is also quite proud of his work. So it's clear from this passage that landscape entered the English lexicon to describe a work of art, and that's important. That's not incidental or negligible. Because at its very origins, this means that at its very origins, the term landscape, it didn't refer to the natural world on its own. The term wasn't about nature as such, but about creating a picture of the natural world. And the word itself helps us understand this, landscape. The word itself refers to a view or escape of the land, not the land itself. So implicit in the term landscape is the idea of transforming the land, transforming the natural world into a view, a thing that is distinct from a section of the Earth's surface on its own, distinct from something that is simply there. The transformation of, so landscape refers to the transformation of the land into a view through either the act of looking at or representing it. And I'm showing you here two images that will give you a sense of what I mean by this, because what results, the thing we call landscape that results by looking at or representing of it, consists, again, not of nature, but a portion of the world that is identified, isolated, extracted, arranged, and ultimately consumed by us. And so I'm showing you a sketch on the left of a fellow out in nature looking at a Claude glass, or into a Claude glass. And a Claude glass in the 18th century was a tool of the picturesque tour. Gentlemen and gentlewomen took it out into nature and held it up against the natural world, and it mirrored some of that world, sucking a section of that natural world into a kind of ready-made picture. And what you're looking at on the right is a sketch made by William Gilpin, most likely using a Claude glass. You can see how the Claude glass that he uses out in nature has identified, selected, and drawn in a section of the natural world, transforming it into a picture. So the idea of landscape as a matter of looking at and representing the natural world, and not as nature itself, is literalized in the acts of the picturesque tour that took place in the 18th century. Another way of saying this is to say that landscape happens only in relationship to the human, and it cannot exist apart from the human. Now, none of this is breaking news. The account of landscape that I've just presented is by and large the definitive one in art history and other related disciplines and areas of study, including the environmental humanities that take landscape as its object of study. So this is a definitive account. It's not wrong, and I don't disagree with it, but I do take issue with a couple of things. First, I take issue with the idea that this is the only possible account of landscape, that what I've just presented is the only way we can understand landscape. And second, I take issue with the idea that any time the natural world is seen or represented by humans, the result can only be defined as landscape, okay? So I don't think that this is the only possible account of landscape, and I don't think that every time the landscape is seen or the natural world is seen and represented, it must be defined as landscape. And this will become, what I mean here, it will become more clear as I proceed. And what I'm going to try to suggest today, by way of a series of thought experiments, is an alternative to the prevailing paradigm of landscape that responds, in a sense, to my problems with that paradigm. What I'm going to try to present today is a different way of seeing or formulating landscape that doesn't abandon the term altogether, but that reimagines it and reimagines it as existing in excess of the human, right? Landscape is not supposed to exist apart from the human. I'm interested in what it means to imagine landscape as existing in excess, as something bigger than the human, as exceeding a human point of view, and also as something very unlike what we think we mean when we use the term landscape. And I do this, and this is why I call this a thought experiment. I do this knowing full well the logical and the epistemological problems, the impossibilities and the paradoxes associated with an attempt to talk about landscape apart from the human. The human can never be wholly absent from the equation, nor from any attempt to imagine landscape as both itself and also not itself. Because again, a landscape cannot exist without the human. But I'm going to give it a shot, again, as a thought experiment, largely because the concept of landscape, as we've long understood it, as bound to, even beholden to the human, landscape as a constitutively anthropocentric concept or idea, well, it's not working all that well for us right now in the Anthropocene, in an age of global climate catastrophe. So that definition, that prevailing definition or paradigm of landscape, isn't doing us a lot of good in this moment. And also because we can't really get rid of landscape altogether, nor do we want to, because getting rid of landscape, throwing it out the window, would mean negating any relationship between the human and the ecological. And that's not an outcome that I think any of us want. So I'm going to start here with a pen and ink sketch made by the Philadelphia-based botanist William Bartram around 1765. This is a sketch that Bartram made in 1765, and it depicts the Great Alachua Savanna, which is an area in north central Florida that consists of low-lying prairie and freshwater marsh surrounded by woodlands. And I think you can see that basic configuration in the sketch, and it totals about 20,000 acres. Bartram made the sketch while accompanying his father, John Bartram, who was at the time the most prominent botanist in British North America. Remember, we're in 1765, so it's still British North America. William Bartram accompanied his botanist father, John Bartram, on a scientific expedition to the Florida Territory. John Bartram was on this expedition because he'd received a royal commission, a commission that tasked him with assaying Great Britain's newly acquired territorial holdings in what is now the southeastern United States. So William went along to help his father out. So the British Crown tasked Bartram with surveying this territory. And William helped out. So what we're talking about is a scientific expedition, but also an empire building initiative conducted to survey the new terrain, its resources, and its existing populations. In this case, the indigenous Seminole people, with an eye, wait for it, for potential settlement. What else is empire building, right? So in the sketch, what we see is William Bartram, recording the basic features of the landscape, its flora and its fauna, and he offers a schematic map of the chief physical attributes of the region. So he includes its rivers, its ponds, its marshes, its uplands, and its pine flatwoods. And in this way, the landscape, this sketch is very much a landscape in the conventional sense, because it's a section of the natural world seen and represented by a human viewer. In this case, it's a section of the natural world seen and represented by a human viewer that reflects its colonial and imperial context. Because what you have here is a case in which seeing and knowing terrain, both literally, but also figuratively in the sense of containing it in a picture, these things consist in this case of a form of power. But I want you to take another look with me. This is a really weird picture. And before you think, well, maybe Bartram wasn't a great artist, he was a brilliant artist. He could have made a picture that wasn't this weird and wasn't this strange. To start, and bearing in mind the standard definition of landscape as a section of land seen, it's really hard to know who or what is doing the seeing here, and from where, and for exactly what reasons. And that's because Bartram gives us multiple vantage points and perspective. We are shown the savanna from above. We see it obliquely, straight on. We see it from the ground, standing on the ground at the lower left, and from on high, as if looking down on the landscape from a bird's eye view. And in case we didn't get that, he gives us three birds. Oddly drawn, I think herons, perhaps cranes, who are looking down and surveying the terrain. All right, so these are details. These are sections that I've extracted from that larger whole. So he gives us multiple points of view and perspectives, and he also incorporates dramatic and impossible shifts in scale. And I think you can see that in the details I'm showing you, where animals are giant in relation to lakes and streams. Some plants are massive, like in the lower right-hand corner next to the teeny little trees that sit next to them. So he incorporates and gives us impossible and dramatic shifts in scale. He also combines really close and careful attention to detail in rendering some of the things in the sketch, but also schematic and a summarizing approach in other details. There are sections of this image that are hyper visible. If you look at the tropical plant in the middle section, it feels as if it's right there before our eyes, but other things look muddy and obscure. So what results is a striking combination of a sweeping panoramic view and a collection of mismatched and unwieldy vignettes, pictures within pictures, wholes and parts, an odd aggregation of incidents, and also of plant and animal protagonists, rendered with varying degrees of precision and intelligibility. Oh, those are two more details you can see a little bit better what I'm talking about. Put another way, Bartram's sketch, which I've called a landscape, is not this. This is a painting by Claude Lorrain from 1639, and it's a painting the kind of painting that is that is quite often described as exemplary of the beginning of the landscape tradition. So Bartram's sketch is not what one might characterize as a conventional or traditional landscape view. Nor does Bartram's sketch do what this one does, which landscapes were supposed to do. It doesn't address the viewer and invite that viewer to enter and traverse, imaginatively, of course, but in a way that suggests that viewer can occupy a coherent space as a fully constituted subject, with one point of view, one body moving through space, moving from point A in the foreground to point B in the middle ground, and eventually making it to the mountains in the distance, as a body with eyes that see properly. Bartram, rather, gives us, in his sketch, through its multiplicity and fragmentation, something different. He forces the human viewer. He takes the viewer wandering around in the Claude Lorrain landscape. He plops that viewer into his sketch, and he forces the human viewer into a kind of multiple and fragmented state, into a body that has to be simultaneously large and small, near and far, up and down, here and there, and has to see the landscape in a way that no human eyes could possibly see it. The experience of vision that results is equivalent, I think, to seeing not through a single set of eyes, but through many, and not all of them human. Some of them are bird eyes, some of them are plant eyes, some of them, you might even say, are freshwater marsh eyes. And what this feels like to me is a reversal of sorts, a reversal of the supposedly definitive paradigm of landscape. The definitive paradigm involving a self-contained, intact subject viewing a landscape. What we have here is a landscape operating on the subject and transforming that subject. Instead of the subject creating through looking and making the landscape, The landscape outreaches in a sense, and what results is a kind of splitting apart, dismantling, and multiplying of the viewing subject, almost as if the viewing subject has exploded in the act of viewing into as many parts and pieces as are on view in the scene. So what we have here is not the landscape paradigm. This is not a thing seen and represented, but one might say a condition of desubjectification. And this is what I mean when I use the phrase landscape vision, by which I mean seen with or as the landscape, with or as all of its varied parts, and with or as its animal inhabitants, multiply and diffusely in a manifold and distributed fashion, extra-humanly. Now, this was not Bartram's intent. The weirdness of this picture is a result of him trying really, really hard to make it all seeable at once, all 20,000 acres, as if to say mine, or more accurately, the British Empire's. But the sketch, as a dismantling, disaggregating agent, talks back. No, not you, rather me, mine. Bartram's sketch is an instance, what I'm trying to say here, is an instance of landscape representation where landscape, paradoxically and against the grain of intention, far exceeds, even dismantles the human point of view. And I think there's something similar going on here in an illustration created by the German naturalist Alexander von Humboldt. And this is a fold-out plate. You have to imagine this folded a few times and tucked into a book. This was a fold-out plate that was included in his very important essay on the geography of plants, which was published in 1807. A few years after he returned from a 5-year expedition to the Americas. He was in the Americas from 1799 to 1804. His trip was sponsored by the Spanish crown, and he spent most of his time in Spain's colonial territories in South America. Like Bartram's expedition, Humboldt's purpose, or the purpose of his expedition, was both scientific and economic/political. So he spent time studying the geology, the geography, the plants, the animals, the human populations of South America. But while there, he also assessed Spain's colonial holdings, gathering data about population and natural resources, especially mineral resources, and even more especially silver mining. Now, this is an image he made in the aftermath of his expedition. It's a really interesting image. It's divided into two sections. At the right and left are columns with various categories of data. And in the center is an image of two peaks in the Andean mountain range, Chimborazo and Cotopaxi, in present-day Ecuador. And he calls this image, it's in French in the title, but it's translated as physical tableau of the Andes and neighboring countries. And tableau in French refers to a work of art, not just an illustration, but a work of art. So here's a detail of one of the data columns. The columns contain familiar data like temperature, barometric pressure, and altitude, as well as quantities that seem a little more obscure to us these days. The blueness of the sky as measured by a cyanometer, the appearance of electricity, or the distance at which mountains can be seen from sea level. Together, there are 20 columns in all, and the columns as a collective include close to 1,000 distinct observations and measurements. The central section is annotated with the names of plant species. So he shaved off, or it looks like he shaved off parts of the mountain slopes, and he annotates that section with the names of plant species. And they're arrayed in a bending and curving way in accordance with where he found them on the mountainside. He ascended, he didn't make it to the top, he was very frustrated by this all his life, but he ascended the mountains, or attempted to, and recorded where he saw plants at varying elevations. This was one of his great interests in plant geography. And so he's recording their distribution and range on the slope. And the image here in the center represents 10,000 square meters of terrain That shaft on the right is his solution to being unable to draw everything at scale. So in his book, he writes, and I just left thousands of miles out, and that's what that shaft represents. So thousands of square meters of terrain, and there are over 500 distinct plant species shown. And there is other data in the image as well, including in the sky. He's identified the elevation of various South American mountains compared to mountains in Europe. He notes the height of a balloon ascent over Paris, which happened in the late 18th century. He also notes the point reached by previous expeditioners who attempted to ascend the mountains, probably because he wanted to make clear that he wasn't the only one who failed at the attempt. Now, what is this all about? Well, in Humboldt's conception, the Earth and its phenomena, all of its phenomena constituted, and this is pretty well known, constituted a brilliantly designed network of interconnecting and cooperating forces that added up to a harmonious, stable, unified, and unchanging whole. As a scientist, then, what Humboldt aimed to offer, both through his research and through images that he made of that research on his return, he aimed to offer nothing less than a comprehensive and systematic description of existence, all of it. His magnum opus was called Cosmos, after all. And this systematic and comprehensive description of existence was meant to demonstrate through comprehensive observation and description of all nature's parts, the essential order, interconnectedness, and predictability of nature as a whole. So he believed that by gathering together all of the data of all things everywhere and arraying it in an image like this one, he could depict the essential order of the natural world, of the cosmos. Now, this is a pre-Darwinian view of an orderly, intelligently designed cosmos, to be sure. Humboldt died the year that On the Origin of Species was published. And that's what we see here, what I've just described. What we see in this image is all the parts, all the data observed and collected by Humboldt during his travels, in this case in the Andes mountain range, that when reorganized, at least according to him in this image, was supposed to convey the idea of a unified and interconnected whole. But this isn't really in the end what the picture does. It fails at this, actually. When all is said and done, the physical tableau shows exactly what it shows: mountains, plants, sky, and sea, along with a massive pile of quantitative data. It doesn't really show, and I'm not saying it's valueless as an image, but what it doesn't show is what Humboldt wanted it to: the abiding and constant connections among all of these things and all of these data. It doesn't show the essential super integration of existence that Humboldt wanted it to convey. And you might even say, perhaps uncharitably, and again, without describing this as a valueless image, you might even say that the physical tableau is a picture of everything that so easily winds up being a picture of nothing, or at least nothing approaching the sum of its parts. Now, that for me is in a way beside the point. No picture can do what Humboldt wanted his picture to do, what he was asking it to do. One could even say that the picture's failure is what makes it useful for us in the present. The book I'm writing right now is all about failed pictures, but there's a lot to learn from those failures. Like Bartram's sketch, the physical tableau can be described as a promiscuous image. Promiscuous for its sprawling array of notational systems, words, letters, numbers, lines, symbols, and patterns, and for its proliferation of representational formats: landscape, triptych, profile, map, chart, and graph. for its ever promiscuous, for its ever proliferating points of view, including the points of view of the precision instruments Humboldt used to make his many thousands of measurements, and for the massive amount of data gathered from innumerable sources and entities. Promiscuous for the fact that it offers up a new form of representation. This is an unprecedented image for its moment, as was Darwin's Tree of Life sketch in On the Origin of Species a few decades later. What we have here is a new graphic language that is heterogeneous, erratic, and teeming, polyvocal in the extreme. And promiscuous above all because the picture, after the fact of Humboldt making it, dispenses with Humboldt, casts off its human creator, both by failing to do what he wanted it to do, almost like a revolution or a rebellion. It casts off its human creator by failing to do what Humboldt wanted it to do, and by depicting the world not just in a way that a human would never see it, but also in a manner that renders it patently, even exuberantly, illegible. This in turn precludes the very idea of a viewer, of a human doing the scene. That is to say, if landscape is a thing seen by humans, or a thing created by humans seen, this is an image that precludes that idea, both by negating the viewer's ability to see and know, and by making what the viewer usually can see easily and well in this picture unseeable. So Humboldt's picture, despite itself, despite what it was meant to do, eradicates the very two things that landscape, conventionally understood, requires and arises from. It eliminates the human subject and the seeing and knowing on the part of the human that renders terrain for and by the human, that makes landscape in the end. In this way, the physical tableau is a landscape in the sense that it exists because a human saw, selected, organized, and represented it. But it is also not a landscape, or another kind of landscape, one that comes into being after and beyond the human, while not being unavailable to the human. And this is key, because landscape remains to tell us something, if on its own terms rather than ours. Now, this brings me to my closing thoughts, which I conceive, or my closing thought experiment, which I conceive of in the form of a question, and which I'll address only briefly as my time runs out. What is landscape, if not seen? Or how might we reimagine landscape and the relation of the human to landscape if we can imagine it as never in view? Now, here I have in mind spaces that might be called landscapes because they are portions of the Earth's crust, but that are not visible at the surface or seeable by humans in the normal course of life, by which I mean the spaces and the terrains of the subterranean, or the underground, the layers of dirt and sediment and rock that extend beneath the Earth's surface for hundreds of miles. And I'm showing you here a detail of Humboldt's physical tableau with his rendering of the subterranean, which he calls the region of subterranean plants. And this is a region that he knows is there, and here he's rendered it, so it's part of his landscape, but of course he hasn't seen very much of it, because at this time, very, very little of the underground had been seen. A little bit through mining, subway systems and sanitary systems wouldn't be excavated until a little bit later in the century. So the subterranean it can be a landscape because one can imagine looking at it and then representing it. But it's also something that is, in a literal sense, inaccessible to human vision. Again, unless we dig a hole or a quarry or a tunnel. But digging a hole or a quarry or a tunnel renders it something other than the subterranean, because that lets us in, and it creates a view that for us in the subterranean is now a view of the surface or at the level of the human. It also lets the light in. So in pictures like these, the subterranean was a space of massive fascination in the 19th century. People went spelunking on tours, went fossil hunting, and this was in part because more and more of it began to be excavated. But the second you excavate, the second you open up in a picture and bring light into the mix, the subterranean is no longer what the subterranean is essentially, or the subterranean as such. So in a sense, picturing the subterranean destroys it because it's now seen and it is now filled with light because there is no light in the subterranean. So the subterranean is subject to conditions that make it resistant to landscape, unless the landscape, defined as always hinging on a human viewer, is reimagined and reconfigured, which is what I'm attempting to imagine by way of my remarks today. And I'll close by saying one more thing about this reimagine of landscape. Landscape, if you think about the subterranean as a kind of landscape, not landscape, landscape might be reimagined as a thing seen by something other than a human, because the human cannot see it, or perhaps by a subterranean animal, for instance, like a worm or a mole, creatures that live their lives wholly underground, or as a thing, the subterranean, as a thing that is encountered by a living creature that does not see, perhaps a cave-dwelling salamander or an eyeless fish, two examples of which I'm showing you here, along with a description of them from a guidebook to Mammoth Cave. These are animals that explorers in the 18th and 19th century found fascinating, as did the readers of their accounts. And the question I end with then is, what is landscape for an organism that does not see, after all? For a creature that cannot put things in visual perspective or gather terrain with its gaze? Or what might landscape be were we to try to imagine it? I don't have the answer to these questions, save to say, in closing, that we need to undertake just this kind of imagining, as impossible, even goofy as it sounds. We need to take landscape vision seriously if we want to move beyond the anthropocentrism that will eventually, if we don't relinquish it, render all forms of landscape, all forms of nature moot. Thank you.
Okay, folks, thank you, Rachel. And we are now at the Q&A part of the afternoon. And as is our new habit, the first question should come from a student. And Rachel has just given a long talk, so we can wait for a while. And for those of you on Zoom, I will be looking at the Zoom, what's it called? Questions, if there are any. Oh, we have a question over there. Wait, let's wait for the microphone so that the world can hear.
I'm still formulating the question, but wanted to ask it to fill the responsibility of the student. I guess in the examples you gave, it seems like the Anthropocene is not accounting for all humans, but a certain perspective of the Western male. So if in this changeover from the human to the non-human, how can we account for humanity in its totality?
Yeah, so the answer to that question is long and complex, but it's an essential question because I could have said this more explicitly, but when describing the landscape paradigm, I am absolutely referring to a paradigm that is generated by a white male colonialist gaze, European and then Anglo-European. And so thinking about the animal's eye view is one way to disrupt that. Thinking about other ways of seeing and other perspectives, including indigenous perspectives, would absolutely be part of this project. And one thing I didn't have time to mention is the fact that Bartram in his sketch included a log and thatch dwelling that would have been the architecture typical of the Seminole culture, but it's diminutive in relation to the rest of the landscape and it's empty. And so it's probably inadvertent on his part, but it really does serve as an emblem for the evacuation of the ways of life and ways of seeing of populations native to that region. So for me, that log and thatch structure serves as a kind of signal to bring those views and perspectives back into the mix. Yeah.
And then over there.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful, and I'm wholly in agreement with much of what you're arguing. And I'm wondering if perhaps part of what I was curious, just to begin with, that the Humboldt's notion of stability is a glacier, and it's now the melting of glaciers is at the other end of notions of anthropogenic collapse. But my question is about landscape art becoming, I think in this period, a medium for the cultural invention of nature, which seems oxymoronic because if culture and nature will be the divide that's also being created. But in the sense that an invention of imperial nature that defines land as something that is quantifiable, measurable, classifiable, as in the Humboldt images, and enters the regimes of speculative economies and colonialism. But I'm curious if, following on from your question, if indigenous landscapes like the winter count, for example, which I think represent landscapes in a very different way. But also on the other end, what is not seen in these landscapes is ocean. And water was always that unruly element that couldn't be incorporated into something that was measurable, quantifiable. Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking of Turner's famous slave ship, where the slaves are thrown overboard because they're losing their property value. And the water itself becomes it explodes, and handcuffs are shackles are floating on the surface of the ocean. But I'm thinking of whether in these indigenous portrayals of landscape or these other disruptive seascapes might actually be pushing against and creating some of the disruptions that you're seeing, so that indigenous is not something that can be thought about and added to, but that these settler landscapes were already, and I think there's a lot of evidence from Birgit Branda Rasmussen. She's done brilliant work on the pictograph and the winter count, as these are already in disruptive conversations from the very beginning.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, and I think one of the things that Humboldt navigated was the fact that he was bringing his desire to order and quantify to a space in which he relied on local informants, including indigenous informants. And I think that there's probably a way to see that disruption, because he writes about how what he's seen and what he's being told don't always add up. So I think there is absolutely a way to understand his writing and his image making as containing and materializing some of those disruptions, but also as his project as working as hard as it possibly can to flatten them. Now, what you said about water and oceans and shorelines, absolutely. That, in a way, is the other side of this equation. I advised a dissertation a few years ago about shorelines and the problem that water represented for representation in the 19th century. I mean, there's a reason that most artists in 19th century America painted land and not sea, because water was a real problem as both economically and as the space of geopolitics, but also as a thing that was largely unrepresentable. And there's a whole discourse in the 19th century, starting with Niagara, about water as a problem for art. So I think those disruptions are key as well. The other thing I'll say, and this is more literal, Humboldt is constantly getting wet, and his notes are constantly falling in the river. And he, in some of his journal entries, you can see splotches of muck that he's wiped off, and sometimes he draws sketches around them. But water as a problem is literally in the materiality of his work and his tools. So that's another way in which to figure the disruption you're talking about. Yeah, thanks.
And I think we had a question there.
Yeah. Hi, Rachel. Thank you. So yeah, that was super interesting. And I guess also building off of this earlier question about agency in the Anthropocene, I'm curious about temporality also, and if there's a way in which this idea of landscape that you're critiquing has maybe also failed in terms of accounting for time in light of climate change and other crises.
Yes and no. I mean, one of the things that I think is really interesting about both Bartram and Humboldt's images is that they don't, on the face of it, account for time, but read against the grain, they do, because they register the time of travel. And the 5 years on Humboldt's part of traveling through the Americas, pulling out instruments from his pack, taking measurements, writing those measurements down, sending those measurements to illustrators in Paris, along with the sketch he made. And so that picture gathers together 5 years of time, yet it pretends not to be temporal or to exist in any kind of time frame. And I think that's partly because Darwin. I'm working on my Darwin chapter right now, so Darwin is on my mind. But Humboldt was only, weirdly enough, and it's hard to imagine this was the case in his moment, but he was largely uninterested in time, save for the time it took him, which was always much longer than he wanted it to get his work published, but in terms of Earth time. He speculated here and there in his publications that, yeah, there's probably a lot of time and one day we'll account for it, but that's not my interest here. But I think, again, read against the grain, those images, and this is maybe one of the disruptions that Anne was talking about, those images can't hold time back, and they can't pretend that they're not somehow at the surface of a much deeper time than any picture can ever account for. So that's why I say the answer to your question is yes and no. Not so much for Bartram and Humboldt, but read against the grain, absolutely. They're shot through with time.
So Laura has a question, and then Joao, and there was one there, and then Frederick. Sorry.
First, I wanted to make a link between Humboldt and water in the ocean. I mean, the Humboldt current is the Peru current, and it's named after him because he measured cold waters there. But my question was, so you relate those, like the Humboldt schematic, and I call that a schematic, to landscape, but in the end, isn't that more a scientific sketch, like a figure in the end, more like as scientists we would do it?
Not for Humboldt, because he and if it were anyone but Humboldt, I would say yes, but he described himself as making landscapes.
And he called it a tableau.
And he called it a tableau.
Yeah.
And the words he uses to describe his pictures throughout his publications are the words in Latin, German, Spanish, and French for work of art, which is partly why I allow myself to treat it as an art historian would. Otherwise, no, you'd be absolutely right. Because even though I'm interested in what happens in the picture above and beyond Humboldt's intention, he, as well as Bartram, understood themselves to be making pictures, capital P.
Okay, thank you so much, Rachel. I want to go back to the first question. And the way you responded, it was fascinating when you were saying no picture could do what Humboldt wanted it to do, or because the human cannot see it. So I wonder methodologically, you gave some hints that you could recuperate maybe some of how the indigenous sip into the figure of that physical tableau. But are there ways that, say, indigenous art and mythology could be read alongside, and what would that open up in terms of that complex multiplicity of worlds that are at play in that tableau? That's one question. And the other is, when you were speaking, I was thinking that what's also being destabilized is the very concept of the human. A certain concept of the human allows for that kind of capture and rendition, and to be then surprised or dislodged.
Yeah. So I think Humboldt was very, very interested not just in nature but in culture, and so he was really interested in indigenous cultural practices, architecture, writing, folklore, mythology, and he was very, very interested in language. He didn't have a background in linguistics, but he came from an intellectual sphere that the nature of which one can assume made him versed in thinking about linguistics. And so he's constantly in his writing talking about indigenous myths and terms and commenting on them. But so in the book project that I'm working on, I talk about that. It doesn't, in a literal sense, find its way into the pictures. There are no indigenous plant names listed, for instance. He never, sometimes he cites when he puts a quantity in the column, sometimes he cites, this quantity was gathered for me by Carlos Montefiore, who was a Spanish man living in Mexico and an apprentice to Humboldt. But there's no instance where he says this data or this information was provided to me by a local informant, by one of the indigenous people that I hired to carry my gear, because of course that's what they did. And so there's authorship, but it's not acknowledged, and there's no way to trace it, but that doesn't mean it's not there. And one of the things that I want to do with his pictures is crack them open and acknowledge the different agents that made them possible, including indigenous agents. I can't remember what the second part of your question. Oh yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that what I'm trying to do is use Humboldt and Bartram as ways, counterintuitively, as ways to dismantle how we understand the human. And I don't necessarily want to rebuild it, I just want to expand its possibilities. And that would involve, getting back to what Francesca asked at the outset, that it would involve acknowledging and thinking about multiple possible humans as suggested by multiple possible members of the human race. Yeah.
So unfortunately or fortunately, we have so much interesting questions but I'm getting told by the bosses that we need to wrap it up because we have a class coming in shortly. So could you please join me again in thanking Rachael? And I would like to remind you that we have our fourth and final for the semester, but there will be some more in the following semester. Faculty seminar on December 5th. That is also a Tuesday. Janet Curry from SPIA and Economics will talk about air pollution and mental health in Canada, evidence from fire and changes in wind direction. So looking forward to that. And if you had questions for Rachael, she's here right now.